Good day, good day. This is Redhawk, and I'm here with Mary Anne. And today, we're not just going to the deep end, we're going to dive all the way in. All the way in. What is this totality of who we are? How do we talk about? When I say totality, I'm talking about, our blood and our brains and our viscera and our history and our spirit and our soul. I mean, we can't really limit the meaning of what all that adds up to, that totality of being, but the Greeks had a word for it, and we've limited that word, and the true meaning of that word has been exiled from psychiatry and psychology and psychopathology and psychotherapy, and that word is psyche. Psyche. It was so much more than just the mind. I mean, think of your mind. Who gives the orders for your next heartbeat? It's the mind. The mind is everything. It is our visceral. It is the totality of our being. It is psyche. So welcome to the deep end. Welcome to psyche. And welcome to this presence that is always there, haunting us. Even our egos are sometimes at cross purposes with the current of this intent that lies within us, this amazing intent called psyche. It is the part of you that reveals who you are and how you might be, not just who you are, but that point where being becomes. And see, that's where we all want to live. When Ram Dass says, be here now, he's talking about at that moment, not of hanging in being, but that point where being becomes, to realize there ain't no noun anywhere in sight. It's all verbiage. It's all movement. And the movement is us. So how do we talk about this? How you doing, Mary Anne?
Well, we talk about it very deeply, and I'm getting deep.
Yesterday in my study, and I need to say right up, I'm going again to James Hollis, who's kind of my resident Jungian psychologist and analytic therapist. I'm going to his book, On This Journey We Call Our Life, Living the Questions. It is nothing less than a constellation of epiphanies ready to happen as you read it. It puts things together in your own life that seem irreconcilable, but not only are reconcilable, but you see what draws them together. And that is what we're talking about today, this totality of being. And we're just going to refer to it as psyche. Psyche. Now, there are really two roots to psyche. The first is breathing. Psyche only works in those human beings who are breathing. Second, there is this invisible life force which seems to enter us at birth and leaves at death. And it is, Hollis calls it teleological process of evolution. It's like the butterfly. It's this transformative movement that is happening in us. And teleological has to do with the purpose of a thing and as its movement through time and unfolding that purpose. So that's what we're talking about. Not seeing things as they relate to the causes and all, but what is their purpose and how does that unfold and how do we ride it so that we find the purpose of our own being?
And is there a purpose?
Well, yeah. The problem is, and we're going to get to that, and of course the problem is it's a mystery.
Right.
And it's an unfolding mystery. So how do we dance in that reality? Jung basically says the psyche is far from being this homogeneous unit. On the contrary, it is a boiling cauldron of contradictory impulses, inhibitions, and affects. And for many people, the conflict between them is so insupportable that they even wish for the deliverance preached by theologians. So intolerable is the conflict between these internal contradictions, and we all have them, that many are seduced by this totalitarian thinking of one sort or another. And of course, it really relates to our time, and I'm hoping we're going to have time to get to this point of what happens in times like now that are constricting, this empathic collapse that we're experiencing. So
yeah, we it seems like there is this drive to find someone to give us the answers rather than getting in touch with our own psyche, our own life force, and figuring out what is the purpose of this.
And the issue is living the questions.
Right.
And we're beginning there and we're going to end there because that's the way the mystery is. I'm sorry, but it's been that way since the beginning. And when the last human being takes their last breath, when consciousness finally lets its last awareness go, even then it will be happening the same way.
Well, and there are some questions that lead us deeper and there are some questions that distract us.
Yeah.
And I think asking why is going to lead to a lot of distraction. Asking what is the purpose is going to take us to a whole different place.
Yes, and those are important questions to always, what I call on an endless loop in your mind. So if we're going to talk about psyche, this totality of being, how do we remember? How do we reconnect? How do we do that? Well, first of all, Hollis lays this out beautifully. He says that he relates it to three different things. The first is we have to recall the manifestation of the psyche herself. This process of being in a state of becoming. Always in a state of becoming. Jung says that psyche is the starting point and the ending point. I mean, it really is. We don't know what the mystery of this cognitive thing is that we're all, receiving the world around us and language and everything else. We know that there is a neurological and chemical basis that's creating this matrix of consciousness, but we don't know how those two connect. But we can talk about the properties of it. And this, of course, is where myth and your own personal myth, and that's what we're talking about. When you get into the totality of yourself, you're talking about what is your myth and how does it work with the great myth. And the Hebrews had a great word for it. Actually, it was two words. It was called tikkun olam, which is the process of healing of the world, of repairing the world. And that there's an element within us that is trying to link up our own reparation, if you will, with the healing of the world itself.
And maybe that's the ultimate purpose right there.
Well, and if you go to the show On the Point,
right,
that's exactly what it is. It all comes down to the evolution of the unfolding of justice. But let's keep building our model here. The one thing we have to remember in recalling psyche is we think there's this I, right? But the I which can know is only a small part of this greater I which doesn't know. The not I, if you will. And that contains even this puzzled consciousness I am wont to confuse with the I. I mean, we're living in a house of mirrors. And what we call the mind, we keep looking for this unbelievable process of finally becoming one and at peace. Well, it doesn't, the holy people are they're swimming in the same stuff most of us are drowning in. It's the same stuff. It's this seething cauldron. And if you look at what meditation is a discipline. It's not letting the mind wander. As a matter of fact, it's just the opposite. It's a discipline, whether it's your breath or a mantra. It's something to hold it so you can see when your mind wanders and you can find that junction and you can see that there ain't no peace. There is no peace. But you can find quiet even in the midst of that. It's like the Zen warrior. Even in battle, they are in this centered place. It's not emotional for them in the way it might be for a lot of us.
Well, you can also see that you can bring it back, too.
And that's the piece.
Right.
That's everything. Hollis calls that coming home. He even says that every meaning, even the distorted meanings that our memory's full of, these little inner voices, our conflicts, our little joys, each of them is a potential gate into psyche.
Right.
That whole seething thing, every piece of it is a part of it and is a thread that is tied to the totality. And it's just beginning to be aware of that. Be aware of that.
Well, and something else that you were talking about there made me think of the whole idea of impersonal versus personal. And, I was down at the river and watching, we've got those falls coming down heavily right now.
Oh, man, beautiful, too.
When you watch the spray come up, and it was like you could see these little droplets coming up, jumping into existence, and then falling out and merging back into this raging river, and it's like, that's us.
That's your mind. Welcome to Psyche.
Right, we're popping up, and yeah.
And each of those little spray is a fragment of ourself, right. A little sub-theme of our own deeper mythology that's trying to make itself known. So here's the piece, the second piece. The first piece, of course, I just said, is recalling, trying to recall that all these pieces are part of Psyche. The second of that would be paying attention to what Psyche has to say. Now, you see, the ego many times wants money and security and happiness and all this other stuff, but the intent of our larger being sometimes is contrary to the ego's stuff. What if our psyche needs us to fail? What if there's a part of us that needs to fail and to explore that piece before we can find that there is no real measure of success and failure?
Right. And I was just you think of that in really practical terms, that if you get fired from a job and you feel like a failure, well, maybe that needed to happen in order for you to be able to take that next step. And we hear stories of that all the time.
And, in that same sense, our positive stuff. One woman that was who Hollis was their therapist, one of his patients, I guess, clients, she said, I kept thinking the next thing would bring me happiness, and then I would get it. And it wouldn't bring me happiness, and there was the next thing. And, of course, that is indulgence in wishful thinking. And that's part of growing up, is moving out of that loop and beginning to pay attention to what our deeper patterns of being are trying to tell us.
And recognizing that happiness is here right now.
And that happiness might not be the real measure. As a matter of fact, happiness might be exactly what we don't need in order to see the next piece. So if you're not happy, Carl Jung used to say, if someone will come in and their wife is leaving them and they were losing their job, I'd say, we're not going to have a session today. And he'd get some champagne and they'd have a drink, because he'd say something amazing is happening in your life and you need to pay attention to it. And it's not going to be comfortable.
Well, it's the whole idea of destruction and creation.
Yes.
And sometimes things have to destruct before you can create something new.
Yes, that's right. And, we're back to suffering again.
Right.
That suffering does something. And that's part of what this podcast is about, is how do you relate it all back to the totality of who we are? So you have to recall Psyche, and you have to start listening to Psyche. And number 3, you have to remember that something is not, we're not just remembering Psyche, but Psyche is remembering us. It's seeking its fullness through us. That deeper part of who you are, your deep, deep totality and intentionality of your own being, your dharma, that whole thing is life itself. And so often that part of us that says we're doing life, see, that's your ego who just says that. I'm doing life. No, life is doing you, and it's doing you through this whole process of energy transformation called Psyche, through this bioorganism that's carrying this mind in some chemical reaction that is just, how did that happen? Seriously. So what do? We've just said, what does it mean to reconnect, to remember the totality of our being? We have to recall, we have to listen, and we have to see that there is this deeper intentionality that's looking for fullness of being through us, using our ego, using all our struggles. And that's hard to do.
But also going beyond our own personal struggles, our own personal life, and remembering that we're part of something greater.
Yeah. And so how do we talk about, if Psyche is what I'm saying Psyche is, and is actually an analog for the totality of the universe, let's say, which I think you just implied, Mary Anne,
Right.
then how do we talk about the qualities of Psyche? Well, Hollis lays them out again. And I love this guy. He does it so beautifully. This self-organizing process that we are each a part of. And I mean, I take notes before I do the podcast because I'm organizing and it's happening within myself. It's kind of amazing. They look like scribbles on a pages to most people, but they're speaking to me. So how do we talk about the qualities of this? Well, let's just get the first quality out there because it's the first and last, and the others are all within it, and that's mystery. This deeper mystery is something bigger than us. We're participating in it. The way I would say it is that each of us, the totality of our being, is literally at the growing edge of the whole universe. We're the most complex happening in the universe yet. We've become self-aware, and we are now participating in the very workings of the universe through the processes that are us.
But not only participating, but integral to it.
That's right. And, part of the mystery and the problem is that we create these constructs to help us navigate our way, and then we marry ourselves to the construct and we miss the mystery.
Yeah, I used to think that of Christianity. It was like people would sit at the foot of the cross, and instead of looking to where that was pointing, they stopped there. And so it's the same kind of idea that there's something beyond that we need to be looking at. Right.
And now we're to the second piece of the something beyond within us, because the second quality of this being, the totality of who we are, is it's autonomous. We don't own it. It owns us. It's going to do us. It wills itself whether we will it or not. And it does this through the third quality, which is process. It is using process, and it does this through a whole series of things. It lets us know, and that gets into the fourth quality, which is dialogue. So here they are: mystery, autonomy, process, and dialogue. And what happens is, if we get hung up in our constructs, if we quit talking to our and being in dialogue with the mystery of our own being, it begins to create symptoms. It begins to pathologize ourselves through neurosis, through conflict, hysteria, violence, and listen to this, mass possessions. Possessions.
Explain that.
Well, here's the gig. What one sees in the polarization of human societies, which we're seeing right now across the planet, is not only this shriek of unaddressed fear, and there's a lot of people are afraid of the otherness,
right?
But there's also this whimper of limited imagination, and that's right out of Hollis. And I want us to see that unaddressed fear and limited imagination. Everything's constricting, and what happens is violence is erupting. And where is it erupting? It's erupting among some of our innocents. These are many of them young, vulnerable boys who are in the midst of a testosterone rush, and the whole mythic system that allowed them to be in touch with the mystery of their being, to be in dialogue with it, to be processing with this deeper being, it's been so repressed that it builds and it builds and it builds, and it has the perfect vehicle to come out through violence.
We're definitely seeing a lot of that lately.
And we're also seeing the polarization of our society. And that's the piece to me that hurts a lot. My internal world has been polarized for years. But
Well, I think we all have a little bit of that going on.
we do. And now comes into the trick of empathy. You know, we want the other person to have empathy, but we don't want to always have empathy for them. I try to crawl inside a Nazi's head. I try to crawl inside one of my friends' heads who put something that is, it feels like passive aggressiveness. And I try to understand where their fear is. As I talk to people whose religion is guns, I try to get inside their head and what's really going on when they misquote the Second Amendment, or they haven't done any of their research about their rights, but they're just, I can do this because it's fun. There's a whole, how do I get inside that place so I can feel their fear with them? And that's not easy to do. So how do we do that? We have this totality of being, right? And how do we learn to remember? It's interesting, the word German, and I want to suggest that the word remembering and the word homecoming, and Mary Anne, you implied this at the beginning, it's like coming home. They're really the same word. And I want you all to remember that in our first or second podcast, we talked about religion's original meaning being relinking, remembering, reconnecting. The German word for memory is, and I might say this, is Erinnerung, and which basically means it's the act of entering.
Interesting.
Going inside and entering. And that's really what we're called to do today, is we're called to enter. We're enterizing. So, Mary Anne, how do we do this?
That's a great question. I think everybody is we're all on an individual path. We're all on an individual journey, but I think we're all trying to get to the same place. And so how is it, and I think it boils down to the simplest of things, the words we use, the choices we make, even the language that we use. I'm taking this class right now, and one of the things that is really being brought up is, and it's Carolyn Mace, and so it's the power of our words. When we use a word like blame, and we want to blame other people, that anchors us way down to the lowest of frequencies. But when we start to think of things as, yes, I'm in this situation, so what do I do with it? What is the purpose of it? Kind of like what we were talking about a little bit earlier, that where do I go from here as far as not trying to figure out why this is happening to me, but taking what is happening and putting it into a larger context and saying, okay, what do I do with it now? There's a reason for this to be in my life, or there is no reason. There doesn't have to be a reason. We don't have to know what that reason is, but the fact is that it's happening. And so what do we do with it? We can either grow bitter or we can grow better. And so, it's just using those words.
Now we're back at Rumpelstiltskin.
Right. I mean, it's just,
you want to turn it into gold, or do you want to just keep it as dross?
Right. Do you want to go back to who you really are and why we're really here? Or do you want to make it all about you and the struggles that you're having?
That's right.
So, yeah.
And that's part of the call, I think, of the totality of our being to our egos. That's what I think many of us in this time are beginning to hear. So I'm going to end with how Hollis really talks about this. He says, once we acknowledge this remembrance, this resonance, this resounding of the eternal that is part of ourselves, which is also eternal, once that happens, he says that there are 4 attitudes or practices that are called forth. He says the first of those is to begin to always read the world with a spiritual eye.
Yes.
He says the gods, they've been trivialized, and I'm reading from him now, they've been trivialized, disdained, forgotten, but they're nonetheless everywhere, and their tracks are in the daily newspaper, in our dreams, and in our tortured histories.
But I actually think we do need a new language, and you and I have talked about this before.
That's right.
Because the old one is breaking down.
And the language of the gods seems primitive, but the new language will be talking about these forces.
The spiritual vibrations.
And the currents
right.
that those vibrations put out. So the first thing we do is read the world with a spiritual eye. The second thing is to do our private work of personal growth. As William Stafford wrote, it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage us back to sleep. The signals we give, yes and no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. Whew, that hurts a little bit. It also means that taking the responsibility to do your inner work is huge. The impact on the world is huge.
And it may not always feel good, but it will get you to a better place.
No. And if we start drifting off, you start being aware you're drifting off. So the first, read the world as spiritual. Second, do your private work. The third, recall that your life is not a place, but a journey. Yes. We're not our history. I think Mary Anne just said that. We're not our history, although it is of us. We are the quality and temper of our journey. I want you to think about, we are the quality and temper of our journey. I have to say, my quality and temper is a little bit hostile. I've been hostile. As I get older, I get a little less hostile, and my hostility is hopefully coming out in more creative ways. But I'm kind of pissed off. So the third piece is know that we're not a thing. We're not our history, but we're this quality and temper of a movement that is the very journey itself. And number 4, we must come to bless this fragile life just as we find it and be grateful for it. Again, Mary Anne, you intone that very well. He says, after all, it's the only life we have, no matter what the suffering, the senselessness, the angst, there's always the soul. And there's always the self. And how amazing this is.
And how hopeful.
And how hopeful. And this is the journey. I mean, what we're looking for here is how do we begin to talk about this? You know, and as a Jungian, this language has been very helpful to me. And we're going to get more into that as we move along. And it's an amazing journey we're on, and I want you all to see this because this is where we're going in our next show. And Mary Anne, before I talk about that, do you have anything you want to say, last words?
No, I think, no, I don't. I'm still down there in the ether, or up there in the ether, so yeah.
Well, I hope you all have enjoyed today's show, and we really want to talk a little bit about where we're going. Because the fact is, we've built these amazing constructs, you know, and we call them, this is the meaning of my life. You know, our language is a construct. But when you look at what a construct is, it's a fiction. Hopefully it's a useful fiction. It carries you from here to there. The language of mythology that the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and the ancient people have, we've deconstructed those and seen that what they're talking about are these forces of consciousness that are moving within us. We've talked about the way that religion itself has taken a single concept, one of love, that is a quality of being, and turned it into a dogma. And how that dogma has created more violence, more divisiveness, more of this what comes between us. As Hollis said, and I said earlier, what one sees in the polarization of human society is not only a shriek of unaddressed fear, but also the whimper of limited imaginations. Our next podcast, Meaning in the Imagination. We look forward to being with you.